Okay, I'm going to get started by talking a little bit about a history of virtual reality, which has, of course, in recent years gotten really a boost through later developments in technologies and the release of the Oculus Rift. But immersive experiences have, of course, a long, long history. We may not have had the technologies to actually realize them. If you just think of Plato's cave, which in and of itself was a virtual reality with reflections of people behind the torches, or the caves of Lascaux, where we only fairly recently learned that they had meant to be animated, because people realized that once you walk through with torches, the creatures begin to move and run along the walls. And then if we can switch to the first slide, this is just one of the friezes from the Villa Pompeii, where people also try to create immersive experiences through storytelling around the room. So you may have on the one side a person who cracks a whip, which then lands on the other side of the room on someone's back. So basically an attempt to create these immersive experiences. And then if we go to the next slide, we of course had early kind of IMAX style attempts, the Cinerama at the World's Fair, a fairly complicated setup, not quite completely immersive, but again trying to create an image space that comes closer to what we're experiencing today, or the Sensorama, which offers us even more than virtual reality, engaging all of the senses with aromas, wind, and vibrations. In the future, we probably get that delivered directly to our brains, and I'm sure that 50 years from now, people will also be very amused with the technologies we're talking about today, unfortunately. So then we have had the head-mounted display, of course, since 1968, and the Data Glove, famously with Jaron Lanier's company, was introduced in the 80s, a very 80s style picture and images. And in the 90s, we already had really landmarks of virtual reality. Char Davis pioneering Osmos and Ephemer. Char Davis created Softimage with her then husband Daniel Langlois, which was later sold to Microsoft. And I think Osmos and Ephemer are still pretty amazing projects. What I find interesting is, first of all, that Char came not out of the technology world, but was a painter. And what bothered her as a painter all the time was the horizon. She always wanted to go beyond the horizon. And creating Softimage and these virtual reality landscapes was her attempt to go beyond the horizon. So in these pieces, you actually can see the immersant as a reflection, and then also a projection of what the person wearing the headset is seeing. And I don't know if we get to it, but Chris and I also had conversations about how you actually pull off showing these works in public space and what that means to an audience. So I also want to just very briefly mention the structures of both Osmos and Ephemer, which I think are still pretty remarkable, even if you compare it to today's works. In Osmos, you have a fairly spatial structure. You start with a Cartesian grid, and then you move from a forest to a clearing, pond, tree, back to the forest, and you have different areas of the earth or of the clouds and the code you can move into. And then Ephemer really had a spatiotemporal structure where you could explore a landscape, then the earth, and then basically revert back into the body, which is very confusing because you're not sure if you're entering someone's body or falling back into your own, basically going through veins and exploring a body from the inside. And all of them are going through temporal kind of structures, be it spring, summer, autumn, or just the idea of germinating, fruition, decay of the body. So fairly complex environments in the mid-90s. And there also have been, of course, a lot of experiments with stereoscopic environments, the cave in particular. This is just one example by Noah Wardrip-Fruin and collaborators, in which you basically explore a text and memories that begin falling off the walls, and then with your hand you can push words back into place, but they start creating different stories, and the end also decay like memories decay or become very distorted. So I also want to just briefly talk about terminologies. What I'm focusing on here right now is immersive virtual reality, where you are completely immersed into the virtual space. Then we, of course, also have augmented reality, where virtual elements are overlaid onto the physical space, and you can explore those through mobile devices. And then mixed reality, where the virtual and the real interact. So I think one of you mentioned, virtual reality used to be video games or virtual reality modeling language in the early days of the web. But there still is a huge difference, I think, between the virtual spaces we explore on the web or in video games and the totally immersive experience. So if you went to Tribeca's Storyscapes, there were a lot of virtual reality experiences, and I think the technology and storytelling have really come a long way. This is just one example. This is basically a rendition of John Hult's audio diaries. He was blind and narrated this diary, imagining the world, and the VR world basically becomes a rendition of that audio diary. And I want to end by just taking a brief look at Chris Milk's Clouds over Sidra, which you may be familiar with. I think what we've seen more recently is really virtual reality cinema. And as opposed to the kind of worlds that we're exploring in art exhibitions very often, real engagement with cinematic experiences. So in Clouds over Sidra, which you typically would explore through a headset, you are in a refugee camp with a little girl. You are exploring that camp. It was done in collaboration with the United Nations, and I think this is just the beginning of an exploration of cinematic experiences. And that creates a lot of interesting opportunities if you really have control over a world, for example, and you can walk in different directions, into different rooms, explore them. Perhaps different things happen if you spend more time in a room, for example. So I think spatio-temporal structures are really interesting in VR, and I hope we'll also get to talk more about it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think that was a great start. I think, first of all, thank you again all for coming. I think I'm also going to rewind a bit to look a little bit at history, maybe in a different lens. To talk about VR, I think it's important to start by talking about R, or just reality. And to kind of recognize that what you see right now is not actually reality. It's a filtered reality. You are seeing maybe 1% of the world around you because you're just seeing visible light. So if you think about it, this room is filled with radio waves, Wi-Fi waves, every heat, sound, everything, but you're just seeing a piece of that. So the kind of false dichotomy of this artificial reality versus this reality that you experience now is a bit confusing, right? So you're already kind of seeing an augmented reality in a way. And so I'm just going to let this filter through, but that leads into the conversation where architects, designers, painters have been thinking about 3D space and drawing it and representing it for years. So if you think about VR right now as kind of this virtual space, and you think about the fact that right now what you're seeing is kind of a virtual space already, it's really just a continuation of that. So part of that is recognizing that the headsets are not what make virtual reality. They are kind of a viewing tool. What makes virtual reality is that ability to experience space, to walk through space, to interact with space, to talk to space. And so through my kind of my background, I started designing architecture. You're working in 3D software. all of a sudden the software allows you to animate things, to move things. And that's something that seems magical at first. Like, what if buildings could move? And then you realize there's people in buildings. Your buildings are already moving. Your architecture, your space is already animated, and you're moving around it. So again, it's kind of an extension. The virtual reality we're seeing now is starting to take advantage of that. You know, the Vive is starting to allow you to walk around, to pick up things, to throw things, to break things. And I think the more and more that these kind of current virtual reality headsets allow you to break things, I think that's super important. That's what makes things feel real. If you can break or if you can fall and hurt yourself, you are going to feel like you're there, and that's kind of incredible. So, you know, hopefully we can move closer and closer to that. And just to speak a little bit about my kind of personal vendetta against user experience design as a word, it's pretty awful, especially in virtual reality where you are not a user anymore. You are a person. It's not like you're using a screen. You are literally experiencing a world. Excuse me. So to kind of push that idea that virtual reality is no longer a piece of software. It's not just a cinematic experience. It's not just a tool or a productivity app. It's not Gmail. It is a world and a universe. And just like this gallery is a world and a universe in itself, my user experience right now is holding this mic, and maybe I'm holding it too close or I'm holding it too far. And that is how you should interact with virtual reality as well as reality. I think it'll eventually get to a few of the projects we're working on now, which are which are these very commercial projects, to be honest, at Framestore. And we're using them to test what it means to be entertained, what it means to be fooled. Can we, you know, there's an Avengers virtual reality experience. That sounds great, right? You want to be in the middle of the action. But is it fun if you can't interact with things? I was watching this great panel recently, and there was two important things, I think, about virtual reality that really stuck with me. One is this idea of dramatic compression, the idea that you want to do one thing really well in VR. At this point, we don't really have the technology where you can interact with every single thing in the world, just like you can in reality. So it's about focusing that energy and that power into one thing. And the other thing is managing expectations. So Clouds Over Sidra was amazing and compelling, but you can't touch anything. And you can't walk around. If you move your head, you get sick. And that's not very immersive. So if we start to manage expectations and start to understand that we are not at the point of fully realized virtual environments, we are not at the point of fully captured live action virtual reality. We are really at the beginning. That 360 video is awesome, but it's very different than being meeting Sidra or being in Sidra and exploring that in person. So again, to kind of reiterate, this is a spaceship from Interstellar. This is a virtual reality hike from Merrill. Again, branded experiences that allow us to test things. We were matching the physical world to the virtual world. What does that mean? Is that confusing? If there's a rock wall in the virtual world and a rock wall in the physical world, does that actually help you? Can you navigate better? Or do you start to notice the differences and say, this rock looks smoother in virtual reality than it does in real world? Do you start to trip over things that don't actually exist? And so I think I'll keep it short so we can get to a panel discussion after, but just my biggest kind of point is that virtual reality is real. We are designing reality. We're not just designing software.
It's true. It's real. I believe it. Cool. Well, thank you, Apex Art, for having us here, and thank you, Christian and Tyler, for providing your amazing insight. My name's Alfredo Salazar-Caro, and I'm one of the co-creators of DMODA, which is the Digital Museum of Digital Art. We have been developing this project since 2013. before actually Oculus launched. So this is something that we ended up kind of like integrating into virtual reality from originally being something that was planned as a video game when we still call that virtual reality, and also like an online platform, but now it's kind of morphing into all these things. So I work on this along with my partner William Robertson, who is also an artist based in Chicago. We both went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where we studied under John Cates, who introduced us to all these ideas about virtual reality, etc. Anyway, so the museum's mission is essentially to create a space, a real or virtual space, depending on how you want to look at it, where artists who are working within these mediums can have a place where you can congregate and see these works together. I guess it was something that was really important to me back in 2013 before. Right now we're seeing a total boom of these technologies and artists in many fields working within them. But back in 2013, it was a different story, and I felt like there wasn't anywhere to kind of like see these types of works. Although there have been some other online platforms like Panther Modern and Crystal Gallery, I think it was called, from 2010. So, there's been people attempting to do this, but I wanted to kind of push it to the next level, and then Oculus came out, and it was just, ideal. So we're looking at some kind of screenshots from within Demoda, within the game. And basically, we wanted to also create kind of like an anchor to reality, which is maybe something to do with the user experience or the person experience, maybe, to avoid that. To just kind of have something that would kind of put people back into a physical place, even though we have the capability of go wherever. And then once you're anchored in, you can go into the artist's works through these portals. And then, the artists are completely uninhibited to create whatever they want and whatever experience they want people to have. So in the first exhibition, we had the work of Jacoby Satterwhite, who is, many of you probably know him, is an amazing new media artist who has been creating these insane landscapes for a while now. So we were really lucky to have him participate. And also, by the way, that we'll have a Demoda demo version running on this computer later on, so you guys can try it out. Unfortunately, it won't be an Oculus, but at least you get to run around it. And then this is Claudia Hart, who's a bit of a pioneer. She's been working in new media since the late 80s. And this is her first VR piece. We wanted to provide that for them. This is the work of, oh man, he's gonna be mad. It's crazy when you start working with all these artists and then you start forgetting all the names. That's okay, I'll go back to him. But he's German, and this is actually, he's been working also since the late 90s. And that was his first 3D piece reconstructed for VR. And then finally, this is the work of Aquanet 2001, who is a Mexican duo from Mexico City. And this is what they believe would be Donald Trump's and Sarah Palin's son. So their experience was to give you a one-on-one with him. So this is a bit of the way that we installed the museum in Transfer Gallery. So that's another thing about the way that we're working. Since we're a virtual institution, we don't really have a physical manifestation except for uncertain moments. So the way that we've been working at this is by essentially moving around, different spaces that are affording us, or they're inviting us to curate inside of their space. And then we take an exhibition and we move it around. So this was the inaugural exhibition at Transfer Gallery here in New York. This is actually where the data is contained for the museum. So this is a 3D print of one of the pediments from the museum that contains the data, and it's also magnetically levitating, which just looks really cool. So we showed a transfer, then we also showed during Miami Basel, and then we are showing in Berlin coming up in May, and then we'll be releasing our second version, our 2.0, in September. So we're kind of touring around and developing at the same time. This is just a breakdown of the museum. So we were having kind of a small conversation earlier about architecture and VR and its relationship, and I guess this idea of creating spaces and the liberty that you have within virtual reality. So it's really cool that I'm basically allowed to have a playground in architecture with this. And so we're also, maybe it'll come up in the next couple of slides, but the next batch of artists, we're actually having 4 artists the same way that we did before, and we're also inviting another artist to create an architectural element for the space. So we're kind of trying to balance those things. This is the way that we installed in Miami. We had this little mobile cart unit, and that's Brian Whiteley, who was the director of Satellite Fair, and he's deep in VR. He really loved it. Let me think. Yeah, so that's kind of where we are right now. We are, happy to be touring and be continuing to developing this project. This is a bit of the new terrain for the 2.0 Dimoda. So we're kind of like making it, we're stepping away from that reality that we wanted to anchor, and we're gonna bring it kind of further into a surreal environment. But still within some limits, because we want the artwork to be kind of the emphasis, really, which is, back to like the idea of museography and how that works in virtual reality. That's kind of an interesting problem, maybe. How do you show something in a virtual space but not make the show space, overwhelm the art itself? These are some images of the new artists. So we're going to be working with, some of you guys might probably know some of these people, Brenna Murphy, Theo Trian, Rosa Menkman, who is an awesome glitch theorist, Mio Van Stennis from Venezuela, which was in the corner, and then La Turbo Avedon, who is an avatar artist. And just to kind of wrap up, this is more about my personal practice. So some of this is the work that I've been developing for myself. So this piece is called Border Crossing Beta 2.0. And this kind of brings together my interest within VR and also physical reality. So this is essentially a video game where you get to be an immigrant who has just crossed the U.S.-Mexico border at the Arizona desert. And you basically get to roam around till you die, basically, in search for something. But the idea within this was also to create it's actually like an in-progress documentary. So I'm interviewing a lot of immigrants, people who have actually made this trek, and people whose families have made this trek, and integrating that within the space. So once you navigate the desert, you can find different vignettes of people's lives, and you get kind of a bit of a narrative from their perspective. But it's totally open-ended, and in the end, you always die, which is really Kafkaesque and brutal. But I think it gets the message across. And these are just some kind of sketches for the next iteration, which will actually include more of a virtual experience with headsets. And that's pretty much it. So, thank you.
Yeah, I think there have been so many interesting issues you've touched upon. So one thing that came up, I guess, in all of our brief talks, and that I would like to talk about more, is the relationship between reality, virtual reality. I think we all agree that this idea of virtual reality as something, as a dichotomy and completely different from reality, is just a false setup from the start, because we are always experiencing the world in a mediated way. Our eyes already mediate. And it's interesting that when media theory came about, or people started thinking about theory, they drew a line there. So media is the extensions of the body. But let's not start with the body, because then everything is mediated. But of course it is. So particularly in the 90s, I just remembered there always was the dichotomy RL, real life, and virtual kind of life, and even the New York Times used that acronym, and then everybody
IRL?
Yeah, and everybody complained about it, and then it was dropped, and now it's coming up again. So I think it's clear that everything is our reality, whatever that experience is, whether we're wearing a headset and we're in a virtual world, or whether we're sitting here. But also coming back to what you talked about, I think there are significant differences, and that is embodiment. Yeah? You are still embodied in the real world, even if you are experiencing a virtual one. And virtual reality, of course, has been criticized for being very ocular-centric, you know, that it's just engaging at this point predominantly with the eyes and not with the reality surrounding you. And you showed a piece where it tried to bridge that gap, but that brings up all other kinds of issues, of course. Where does it become absurd? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that relationship of embodiment in the real world and the virtual constructs we're creating. Yeah,
yeah, I think just the fact that we're pointing out that virtual reality is really just focusing on the eyes right now is incredibly important. It makes me think of noise-canceling headphones, but for your eyes. That's kind of what virtual reality is right now. It's kind of one piece of the puzzle. It's great to listen to music with, or it's great to watch a movie in. But I think, you know, there's a few steps before the floor you see in VR is the same floor you feel with your hands, or that you hear your footsteps on, or that you taste, if you go that far. So I think it's interesting to think about it as kind of like a scaled reality almost, or some way of just kind of jumping off here, some way of kind of evaluating the degree of reality, which may be completely false if they're all kind of real. I don't know.
And, yeah, one quick follow-up question. Do you think that it should be the goal at all to create this immersive, sensual, haptic reality, or is the beauty of it having an out-of-body experience? Yeah.
The Matrix, basically. That's what you're talking about. I mean, I think there's totally merit to being able to have full human experiences through an apparatus. I mean, just if we can get to that point, that's incredible. However, the implications of it are so extreme, you know. I mean, the Matrix, right? I mean, we don't really want to get there. However, it would be really cool if we did. I don't know. I think that just having a headset on, or even like if we forget about the headset for a minute and we just talk about Facebook, you know, the way that you can completely become absorbed into this type of environment, regardless of whether you're embodied in it or not. I mean, it's incredible. You know, I mean, I've certainly have spent many hours on Facebook and completely unaware of my environment, you know. So I think that when you take it further into virtual reality, and then you take it one step further into the idea of, you know, the metaverse from Snow Crash, so like basically Facebook plus virtual reality, I mean, I think it's gonna get to a point very quickly where we will be, even if we're still embodied in physical reality, we'll just be completely absorbed. And I don't know how important it's gonna be for us to feel these things. I don't know.
Do you think we should be allowed to be fully immersed?
Oh, of course, we should be allowed to do anything. I was just wondering whether that just should be the goal. I mean, sometimes you see that absurdly there are certain goals imposed by an industry, for example, that are also counterproductive. If you look at early virtual worlds online, they were incredibly inventive, totally crude, but, you know, really, really inventive. And then comes Second Life, and it's basically a reduction to, you know, real life with a commercial system, and doesn't revolutionize the world anymore. You know, so I think sometimes you have these limiting ideals imposed. I think it certainly is interesting, but I'm not sure if it should be the highest goal to achieve. You know, I think there's also a beauty to, again, becoming more aware of your embodied experience. I mean, you mentioned the example of, oh, here's the virtual wall and you're touching the real one, and there's a difference between them, you know. I mean, we just learn about our bodies and perception in the process, which I think is important. But I also have come across reports of some developments that seemed completely ridiculous to me in an endeavor to be more embodied and immersed, where you have to sit down in a chair and you see this person standing in front of a big chair that at some point in their experience they will sit down in. There's just such an absurdity to that whole setup, or full rooms that try to mimic the world you're experiencing. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to kind of add that as a goal, this kind of full immersion has, I think, a huge potential for just utility. You know, in terms of, again, visualizing architectural spaces, visualizing products, visualizing social interactions. If I'm hanging out with friends on Facebook in VR, I want to be completely immersed in every way. I want to go over and give them a high five and see what that means in VR.
There's actually a video of Mark Zuckerberg high-fiving somebody in VR, which is really weird.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think it's a kind of, I see it as an inevitable future, and I see it as something that could be incredibly useful to reduce travel, to reduce isolation, disability, etc.
Yeah, I think
Oh, sorry, I was just going to add, you know, not just in virtual reality, but just kind of like in the way that we are interacting with our technology and like our mediated experience already, this kind of idea of the quantified body is totally taking off, you know, like all these people that are using their smartphones to kind of keep track of what they're doing, like, you know, the miles they're running, or, you know, like their heartbeats, or, you know, whatever. Like you can really break down the activities of your physical body and put them into information, turn them into information. So I think that, you know, once we kind of integrate more with this technology, it will just naturally lead towards a deeper immersion.
Oh, that's true. I mean, in the kind of mixed reality, we're much further along when it comes to the quantified self, and turning ourselves into data bodies. And I also would agree with you that there's a huge potential to VR, to storytelling, and also practical purposes, of course. And I'm sure, on the other hand, that we'll see a lot of absurd and failed entertainment. Another thing I wanted to touch upon was just the creation of virtual spaces in and of themselves, because I think your museum is an interesting case in that you try to combine the already existing virtual works of people with an interesting architecture to explore and unify them, rather than having, different headsets or screens or whatever it might be to experience those works. And there's something, I think, very intriguing about that. But there are also certain questions to it. What does that mean for an aesthetic experience? If you have very different pieces with very different aesthetics, do you actually structure the rooms around them as you would in an exhibition environment, basically as a creation of an exhibition design specifically for all of the pieces, rather than just plugging something into the space? Or how do you negotiate those constructions?
I mean, I think it really just boils down to, like you said, like basically exhibition design and, a good curatorial practice, just being aware of what these artists are doing and how they communicate with one another. And I think that, again, like the whole idea of the museum or the White Cube is to kind of be a neutral space for artwork to exist. Obviously, in VR and with this particular museum is not exactly the case, but it's still, the idea is to maintain them neutral enough to like let the artwork actually, be what it is. This second edition, we are working with two curators, Elena Acosta, who's actually here, and Eileen Skyers, who just moved to New York. I don't know if she's here. But this is also like helping us a lot to kind of, bridge the gap between artists and being able to have something that is even more cohesive throughout the space. And we're also going to be altering the space in order to kind of, I guess, like bridge the space between the museum and then the artwork in a bit of more kind of like a seamless fashion. But it's something that we're continuously exploring and experimenting with.
I I've just found it. I have to try it. I haven't tried it yet, but it's incredibly fascinating to think about exhibit design in VR and its relation to architecture. I think when I was first kind of starting to venture into VR from architecture, I was like, oh my gosh, there's no gravity. I can do anything. There's no constraints. I can, build as tall as I want, as deep as I want. I can be an inch tall, or I can be 100 feet tall. And I think the interesting thing you learn quickly is that there are different constraints. There's processing power, there's polygon counts, there's latency, there's light. You can't have an all-white space, you're going to go blind. And so the bad part of gravity of a building falling down is the same as having a too complex a model in VR where you're lagging and you get sick from the computer and from the experience. So I think key to designing anything in virtual reality, just like in reality, is setting up those constraints, figuring out how much space, virtual or real, these exhibits, will take, how you navigate from one to the other, and really pushing the highest quality design you can, right? You want to make the best building out there when you can. You want to make the best experience out there when you can, and that's something we're doing too. When you're moving through a space, you want to make sure you're moving at the right pace. You want to make sure nothing is blinking or flashing in VR, so people don't get sick. You're designing an experience. You're designing a behavior and an interaction. So I can't wait to try it.
Yeah. It's interesting that we basically have to learn how to see in those worlds. I mean, for some people, it's a huge adjustment, and they get really, really sick. Yeah. So the impact on our bodies is enormous. And you actually mentioned before also medical and practical uses. I went to one environment that was exhibited, I think, at the Hewitt Triennial at some point, and you were basically immersing yourself into just an ice-scape of penguins, snowballs, and it was built for burn victims. Because it actually brings down your body temperature, being in that virtual world. And I also had another experience when I used one of the Stanford VR Labs applications, where basically you were just at this construction site and you were elevated on a kind of plank ramp over a concrete pool, and you could then walk over the plank. It was fairly high and scary. And of course, I immediately asked them, so what happens if I step off the plank? They were like, well, you'll fall. So of course, I had to try that. And despite the fact that I so knew that I'm just taking one little step forward to get my body to do that and jump off that plank and start falling was just enormous. So we really have to also retrain our bodies in those worlds, or limit them in a way that it basically coincides with how we navigate the real world. So another thing I wanted to at least briefly talk about was the experience and experience design in public space. So we're all talking about these worlds, but there also is the fact that they're not that accessible or fairly solitary. Okay, if you have your Oculus at home, you can probably purchase applications. But in an exhibition environment like this one, you're not sharing the experience at all. Everybody is standing there with their headset, and at the opening, you're struggling with long lines. So how do you navigate those boundaries? Because I think it's just a completely different experience of exhibition. And when I talked to Chris at the opening here, you said to me, well, it almost becomes like a performance people are watching, because somebody is standing there seemingly blind, performing for them in a world that we all can't see. So there definitely was some weird performative dance going on. But how do you solve those issues?
I don't think anyone has yet. I think that's a great question. I think, first of all, it's important to point out, kind of zooming out, that right now virtual reality is incredibly elitist, and only the wealthiest can try it or buy it or experience it or have access to it, which is just a frightening kind of start to the conversation. But that in itself, the ability to access high tech is an issue in itself. And is this valuable? Is this providing something to a larger audience? I think it's great that we're all here and that we are all hopefully able to try it, or try it tonight or soon. But I think what does it mean for everyone in the world to be able to try an Oculus or to be able to try virtual reality, and how can that be provided? But I think in addition to that, it is a performance. It's speculative sport, speculation sport, whatever, and it's fun to watch people mess around and look like they are drawing things and poking people and knocking into people. We constantly have people tripping over things in the office and hitting people in the head. And it's messy, and I think that's great, and I think it's a matter of also adapting the physical world to deal with that. So we need a bigger office now.
I mean, hopefully we'll go wireless pretty soon, and that will solve a lot of issues. But, I mean, I have yet to see something that I think is the perfect solution within an exhibition type space. But I think, I mean, for example, with the Demoto exhibition, what we did is we actually had screens directly above the Oculus, so people that were standing there wouldn't just look at somebody moving their head around and using a controller, but rather they would actually see the experience. And then we had a large projection where people could come up and play the game as a preview before they actually got immersed. And this kind of comes with some issues because some people see that and they're like, oh, okay, like I get it, I saw it, that's it, but they don't understand that there's actually, once you put the headset on, it's a completely different experience. But overall, I'm just hoping that as this technology becomes more available and more artists and more curators have access to it, that we'll be able to come up with kind of better solutions for this type of exhibition. And also, what we were kind of chatting about earlier, how does it work in the Tribeca Film Festival if you're showing a VR film and there's, 2 headsets and a waiting line of 100 people? I mean, it doesn't really make any sense. So hopefully in the near future, we'll start to see places where people can, people that don't have access to an Oculus at home can go to a theater that has 100 Oculus Rifts or any VR headset, and people could come in, buy a ticket, sit through the movie and have a whole experience, And in a way, like Disney has been kind of doing that kind of stuff, giving like collective, 4D experiences, etc. With like, and this kind of goes back to the Sensorama. I remember when I was 11 and I went to Disney World, there was this ride where you would like sit and there was this like alien thing happening, but you would feel its breath through the seat and you would feel vibrations and you would see images in 3D. So really, I'm sure they're working on it, and as long as we start getting spaces where multiple people can experience all of this at the same time, we're heading in a good direction, maybe.
Yeah. And again, Char Davies in 1995 already tried to experiment with that. And one thing I forgot, also coming back to some of the issues we discussed, interfaces in and of themselves are of course important. And one interesting thing that Char did very early on was use a vest as an interface where your breathing would ultimately determine the motion through the environment. She just took her cue from scuba diving, but it was a very, very clever idea. One of the pieces at, I think Tribeca also tried that. And it felt much more natural than some of the other endeavors at haptic kind of interfaces. So perhaps at this point we should open it to the audience, or I don't know, Chris, if you have any questions or... Okay. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned you used the word solitary when it comes to VR experiences, and I wanted to hear your thoughts about it's almost irony between people saying VR is the biggest empathy machine or the best empathy machine, and the lack of other humans or any human-to-human communication in current VR.
Well, first of all, I think it's great that you bring that up. And it's something where VR is really lagging, while other virtual worlds over decades have already done that. Like Jeffrey Shaw, for example, in his Legible City, did that early on. He made it networked, and you would encounter other people in the world. And I'm actually honestly surprised that not more of that is happening in VR right now. I think that's a little different from Chris Milk's statement about VR being an empathy machine, which I profoundly disagree with, because I think it really depends. Yes, it can generate empathy, but it also can create this dangerous illusion that you're there, part of it, which you're not at all. You know, what you experience will always be emotionally very different from being in a Syrian refugee camp. You know.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly, I think it's one tool of many that can be used to create empathy. I've cried at watching movies before. That was the ultimate empathy tool at that point, at that moment in my life. But, you know, VR can do similar things. I think it's one of many things.
Moderate because I can't see.
So one of the things that we get to experience here in New York is we get public space. You can go to Central Park, and that's an area that's accessible to more or less everybody, and it isn't mediated by, you know, a chain restaurant's architecture or a mall or something like that. How do you see public space existing in the virtual world where can we all meet together?
I think that's something that actually Facebook is sort of working towards. I mean, I'm assuming most of you are aware of this, but Facebook bought Oculus for $2 billion a couple of years ago, and they've been since developing a lot in VR. And I think that part of what their idea is to be able to create spaces for people to commingle within VR. And then there's also, of course, Second Life, which we were talking about just a second ago, who has also integrated VR already into their system. So, you know, there was a big decline in the population of Second Life, but I project that because of VR becoming so prevalent, it will kind of pick back up, or ideally it would, you know, and these would be some of these public spaces.
I mean, Linden Lab just had stopped supporting it, and that's when the numbers declined. But you're absolutely right. People started using it as a virtual public space and just congregating. It's of course still kind of a commercial space, but people would do that. I'm also very interested in that kind of community building public space in massive online role-playing games. Like World of Warcraft has really interesting communities that are outside of the game playing, you know, really create systems of governance within worlds, and it's really fascinating.
And artists are intervening in these spaces,
yes,
and using it exactly as public platforms. You know, Stellark was one of the people that started doing that, and among many others, you know, so definitely.
I'm just going to jump in, and I don't think public spaces will exist in VR. I think it's going to be, everything will be private. I also think the idea that Central Park is a public space is a slight illusion. It's basically creating the real estate market of Upper Manhattan and benefiting private industries and corporations and the government. So that's just my 2 cents.
It's an important distinction to make. I mean, we could discuss for an hour what if we still have public space in the original sense of the word.
So you've all sort of touched upon the tension between something like reality and virtual reality, where reality is also regimented in the sense that virtual reality is also regimented. But it seems as if virtual reality attempts to abolish its own conditions, or this kind of abolishment falls out of the larger context of something like a perfectly designed experience. So all of these kinds of tricks of the eye, where you produce more vertices in order to smooth out a shape, or you blur something so that you get something like a kind of blurring of the eye. These kinds of tricks of the eye fall out of this, but it all seems sort of arbitrary, and it seems to be also tied to something like audience, tied to something like a large kind of cultural context of what is good and what should I buy, or what is a good experience and what kind of experiences should I buy, essentially.
I think that goes back to what I mentioned earlier a little bit, this kind of idea or domination of paradigms of reality and striving for replicating the real rather than using just the possibilities of a world. I think both is justified, you know, whether you tweak it so you have an experience that resembles reality, or whether you really just run with it and have fun with the intrinsics of that medium and don't try to tweak vertices in whatever it is at all. And I think that can also generate amazing results. Of course, it's more what artists are doing rather than an entertainment industry.
Yeah,
or
exactly, and that's, I think that's the major distinction here, and that's why I'm interested in seeing what artists work with, because they have no need for these kind of refinement that the commercial world might be more interested in. I mean, like these things that you're describing, like motion blur and like, you know, vertices count, etc., are things that were designed to try to emulate reality as close as you can. But to me, it's really interesting when people are actually kind of going one level deeper and seeing how they can break these paradigms, you know, and hopefully that's what artists are here for, you know.
I think that also brings up an interesting question about value. In the physical world, value is determined by material, cost of construction, design, quality, etc. And I think in VR, there's going to be a question: what environment is more valuable? What object is more valuable? And is it because it's expensive in terms of processing power? Is it expensive because of design quality? Is it expensive because of texture, which, you know, may equate to material in some way? And right now, there's definitely the kind of tendency towards the skeuomorphia of let's apply a wood texture to a chair because it looks like it should be wood. But I think it's a great question, and why are we applying that texture, and does it add anything? Is it, maybe it does add a certain nostalgia or kind of understanding that helps, but it's a big question.
You touched on the notion of virtual reality being something that only affluent people have the ability to experience. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk to the point on Google Cardboard and how that relates to virtual reality in an artistic context as well, if you're seeing that as something that changes the game, I guess, for bringing it to more people.
Absolutely. I think a Google Cardboard is incredible, but I also think it points out to a scale of quality. A Google Cardboard virtual experience is vastly different than an HTC Vive experience, and it almost exaggerates the difference in device or difference in accessibility. But it is provided access to, you know, millions of people. So that's an incredible accomplishment, and I think they're going to continue to push it. So I hope it continues to gain quality to catch up. But I also think there's going to be need to be some kind of mediation where the quality filters down, or this becomes something where there's headsets at your local library and it becomes a piece of kind of a right in some way.
Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty confident that that will happen. I'm aware of only one project at, I think, the University of Southern California, where they are also trying to just do 3D printed headsets very cheaply, but with a higher level experience than Google Cardboard. Yeah, so hopefully we'll see more of that.
I mean, I think this is probably one of the most problematic aspects of this technology. And, you know, even with Google Cardboard, we're still talking about people that have a high-end mobile device to be able to use it. So, you know, even though a Google Cardboard is cheap and accessible, it's only accessible to those that already have this type of technology around. So, you know, I'm really interested in seeing how this type of technology will be spread around the world. I mean, you know, I'm from Mexico City, and in Mexico City, there's a huge amount of people that don't have iPhones or just like a smart mobile device. You know, even in New York, I'm sure there's like a significant percentage of people that don't have smart devices. So I think the schism is real, man. You know, we are going to see the elite be able to like enter these new worlds and, you know, participate in these new public spaces and these conversations that a lot of people will not have access to. And it's really not any different than what we're seeing now. You know, like, I mean, I remember when I didn't have a smartphone and I wasn't on Instagram and I didn't know about this whole universe of people hanging out on Instagram, you know? So we'll see what happens as these technologies get cheaper and more available, and the old ones that we have are going to start going towards like other places, South America, Africa, Asia, you know, how is that going to happen is going to be really interesting. And I'm almost certain it will create a social schism.
So this is kind of tangential from something that you've already discussed, but addressing questions of immersion and our ability to like believe the space. I'm wondering if like our high definition temporal experience of this world precludes any sort of immersion in, say, a world like Minecraft, or like if we can, if you think that there will be a point at which we can sort of extend back into lower definition and lower literacy counts and still like embody that in the same way.
Well, again, I think it's a matter of learning different levels of mediation, and I also think that the qualitative experiences of those levels is very different. You know, so there are reasons why you would gravitate towards certain aspects of Minecraft or a virtual reality experience, and yeah, they're just fundamentally different, and it really depends on the type of experience you're looking for and also what you want to achieve in the world. Sometimes 2D is much better at doing the job than 3D is. You know, no doubt about it. Yeah.
And it boils down to, you know, artistic agency. You know, a lot of times I feel like there's a big aim towards hyperrealism just because we're, you know, seeing how far we can push our machines and how close we can get to this world that we're experiencing. But to me, always the fun part is when you break it and you kind of go down to a different level and you can actually exploit the machine to create a totally different visual experience from what we're already used to. I actually find copying direct reality to be a little bit droll, you know.
Hi. In terms of being a creator and collaborator, do any of you have favorite groups that are doing things that you recommend connecting with or joining? You know, any advice?
There's a NYVR meetup that has a lot of great people looking to get into VR, doing VR, people from fashion, people from technology, business, people, bankers that love VR. I would just suggest going to that.
I mean, I can just give you some of my favorite artists that are working within the realm. I mean, Jacoby Satterwhite is amazing. He's based here in New York, yeah, so you can definitely check him out. And I mean, I know he's developing a VR piece for New Museum, so that could be coming up in the near future. And we're also going to be updating his piece, so that should be cool. There's also Pussy Crew, based out of, I guess they're based out of LA right now. They've been doing a lot of like crazy music videos. And then Vince McKelvey, another LA-based new media artist that I really look up to, and he's making a lot of crazy experiments with VR and WebGL. I don't know, does that make sense?
Also depends on where you want to draw the boundary between VR and AR. There's also Manifest AR, and Will Pappenheimer from Manifest AR is sitting here, so you can talk to him. So that's a collaborative.
Yeah, there's a lot of people here that you might want to talk to.
So earlier we were talking about like Facebook as developing a way of like using VR as a communal experience, and then someone else touched upon the fact that then that's mediated by a brand. What do you discern in analysis other sort of ethical dilemmas that an artist working in VR might face?
Ethical dilemmas in VR. This is fun. There was just recently an article about torture in VR. That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm just going to say I think the dilemmas are exactly the same in reality. The questions of torture, privacy, fraud, harassment. There was a VR project trying to create empathy by replicating rape scenarios, which is incredibly powerful, but can be incredibly triggering and frightening and horrible. So I would say it's just an extension or a magnification of what the kind of dilemmas that we're already dealing with.
I have a follow-up question then.
Great.
So, you were also talking about how virtual reality is not reality. So what are the medium-specific problems that you might encounter or issues? I mean, I don't know if you have any.
I think we were saying that it is reality.
Well, that it is reality, yes, but there are differences. So what I think medium specific is the issue of embodiment. Again, coming back to replicating haptic experiences, or engaging all of the 5 senses in VR is, of course, not happening, or when it is happening, it can be fairly problematic or difficult. That's one of the issues. And then just the way our brain is processing the different types of visuals can be a big challenge that is very medium specific.
Yeah, just the kind of safety of it, the scientific kind of physiological side of what a headset does to you is kind of unclear at this point, especially with children, especially when we're talking about games that could be pitched to children. So the kind of tobacco question.
I mean, this is kind of like jumping into the future a little bit. But, in a future where we all hang out in VR and we're fully immersed, once the commercial world is, like you were saying, like this experiences might be totally mediated by commercial entities, right? So I was having a conversation with some friends about what's going to happen when advertisements are actually your friends. They just if one of your friends shows up in VR and says like, "Hey, I just got this really sick pair of sunglasses. Like, come check them out," and you're like, "Oh, awesome! Like, this is my friend, I trust them," and you go and you buy sunglasses, but it wasn't your friend, it was actually just an ad, so I mean, it's gonna get strange, and it's gonna be very much something that is specific to this medium.